This content is my summary of Lawrence Gardner views on the real identity of Moses being Akhenaten. Gardner is a noble Gnostic, so his story can be promoting his ideas. Exodus 11:3 informs us that Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. However, despite his importance according to the Bible, it has often been said that there is no documentary evidence of Moses in the records of Egypt. Actually, this is not strictly true, because Moses was discussed, by name, in the history of Egypt, the Egyptiaca, by Manetho, who, as previously stated, was an advisor to Pharaoh Ptolemy I around 300 BC. In a later 1st century AD work entitled Against Oppian, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus detailed that Manetho had recorded Moses as having been an Egyptian priest at Heliopolis. But later in the same document, Josephus, who was trained for the Pharisee priesthood in Judea, takes exception to Manetho's assertion that Moses was an Egyptian, stating, they would willingly lay claim to him themselves, and pretend that he was of Heliopolis. In contrast to this challenge of Manetho, Josephus himself alleged that Moses was a commander of the Egyptian army in the war against Ethiopia. His Antiquities of the Jews further states that Moses took the king of Ethiopia's daughter, Tharbis, for a wife, in order to preserve the peace between the Egyptian and Ethiopian nations. There is no mention of this military command in the Bible, but, in support of Manetho's chronicle, Moses is positively cited in Exodus 2:19 as an Egyptian. The definition draw of the water is of significance here since, according to Exodus 2:10, Moses was given his name by the Pharaoh's daughter because she drew him out of the water. Josephus explains that the Egyptian word for water was mo, while those that were saved from the water were called uses. From this combination of words, he says, derived the biblical name Mo-uses, Moses. In practice, and as pointed out in 1937 by Sigmund Freud, the name Moses is written Moshe or Moshe in Hebrew, and is generally reckoned to derive from the Hebrew word moske, which means the draw out, or from the verb msha, to draw. It is very doubtful that an Egyptian princess would have been aware of Hebrew etymology. She would more likely have used an Egyptian name for the boy she adopted, which rules out any Hebrew derivation of the name Moses. Either way, it is clear that the nominal root explained in Exodus was purposely structured to conform to the role of Oki, the drawer of the water, in the legend of Shahrukin. The essence of this tale comes from the Mesopotamian folklore of Shahrukin, but apart from the romance of the baby in the ark, is there perhaps something similar in the Egyptian record, maybe the story of a boy under sentence who was saved and later governed Egypt? The answer is yes. Yusuf-Yuya, Joseph, was chief minister to pharaohs Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III. When Thutmose died, his son Amenhotep married his infant sister Citamen, as was the pharaonic tradition, so that he could inherit the throne. At that time Citamen was very young, which has led some Egyptologists to reckon she was perhaps a daughter of Amenhotep, but she was his junior sister. A cartouche of Citamen at the Metropolitan Museum, New York, describes her as the great king's daughter, which is to say the daughter of Thutmose IV, not of Amenhotep III. Shortly afterwards, in order to have an adult wife as well, Amenhotep also married Tiye, the daughter of Yusuf-Yuya. It was decreed, however, that no son born to Tiye could inherit the throne, and, because of the length of her father's governorship, there was a general fear that his Israelite relatives were gaining too much power in Egypt. In addition, since Tiye was not the legitimate heiress, she could not represent the state god Amen, Amun. So when Tiye became pregnant, there were those who thought her child should be killed at birth if a son. The first son born to Tiye was called Thutmose, and he certainly did die prematurely. A whip bearing his name was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Tiye then conceived again, and on this occasion security arrangements were made with her Israelite relatives, who lived at Goshen in the Nile Delta. Nearby, at Zaruka, Tiye had a summer palace, where she went to have her baby. It was another son, but the royal midwives arranged to have the boy nursed by Tiye's brother's wife Tiye, a daughter of the house of Levi. Tiye's son Amenhotep, born circa 1394 BC, was later educated at Heliopolis by the Egyptian priests of Ra, as explained by Manetho in respect of Moses, and in his teenage years he went to live at Thebes. By that time, his mother had become more influential than the senior queen, Citimen, who had never born a son and heir to the pharaoh, only a daughter who was called Nefertiti. Pharaoh Amenhotep III then suffered a period of ill health and, because there was no direct male heir to the royal house, young Amenhotep married his half-sister Nefertiti in order to rule as co-regent during this difficult time. When their father died, he succeeded as Amenhotep IV by virtue of his marriage to Nefertiti. Were it not for this marriage, the 18th dynasty would have expired at their father's death. Because of his part-Israelite upbringing, Amenhotep IV could not accept the Egyptian deities and their myriad idols, so he developed the notion of Aten, an omnipotent god with no image, who was represented by a solar disk with downward rays. Aten was not the sun god, however, for the Egyptian sun god was Ra. The name Aten was the equivalent of the Hebrew Adon, a title borrowed from the Phoenician and meaning lord, with the familiar Adonai meaning my lord. At the same time, Amenhotep, Amen is pleased, changed his name to Akhenaten, glorious spirit of the Aten, and closed all the temples of the Egyptian gods, making himself very unpopular, particularly with the priests of Ra and with those of the former national deity, Amen. Akhenaten's household was distinctly domestic, quite different from the kingly norm in ancient Egypt, and he and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. But there were plots against his life and threats of armed insurrection if he did not allow the traditional gods to be worshipped alongside the faceless Aten. Akhenaten refused and was eventually forced to abdicate in short-term favor of his cousin Smenkhare, who was succeeded by Tutankhaten, Akhenaten's son, by his deputy queen, Tiye. On taking the throne at the age of about 11, Tutankhaten was obliged to change his name to Tutankhamun, thereby denoting a renewed allegiance to Amun, Amen, rather than to Aten, but he was to live for only a further 9 or 10 years. Akhenaten, meanwhile, was banished from Egypt in about 1361 BC, although to his supporters he remained very much the rightful monarch. He was still the living heir to the throne from which he had been ousted, and he was still regarded by them as the royal Mose or Moses. Prior to his initial departure, Akhenaten the Moses had been persuaded by his mother, Tiye, to move from Thebes, and this he did, to establish his newly built center of Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, the site of modern Tel El Amarna. However, a fact which reference books generally fail to explain is that Akhenaten did not invent the god Aten. Even before Akhenaten's birth, the boat used by his father, Amenhotep III, on the lake at Zaru was called Tin Aten, Aten Gleams. There was also an Aten temple at Zaru before Akhenaten built his own Aten temples at Karnak and Luxor. The Israelite concept of a god without an image was already established in Egypt before Akhenaten came to the throne. What he did that was so different was to install Aten as the sole god of Egypt, and this was the world's first example of religious intolerance at state level, a strict monotheism foisted upon the people. It was this somewhat discordant concept of the one god in Egypt that originally inspired the 1930s research of Sigmund Freud, leading him to associate Moses with the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten.